Okay, make sure I'm recording. Yes, I am. So we're looking at chapter 14. This chapter is going to focus on the autonomic nervous system. And this picture is showing the autonomic, that there's two divisions to it. One part is called sympathetic, basically prepares your body for physical activity. We often refer to it as fight or flight time. And then the other division of the autonomic is the parasympathetic. This division is in times in control where there's no physical threat. It's time to do digestion, conserve energy, store it if you have it. So this division is often referred to as digestion and relaxation time. So most organs in the body are being communicated by both these divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. It's just that when one's in control, the other one's kind of off. When I was a student, I was often told when sympathetic's on, it shuts off parasympathetic. So kind of like an example, let's say the heart. So when your heart's increasing the amount of beats per minute during physical activity, that would be sympathetic in control. And then vice versa, when the heart rate goes down, there's no threat, parasympathetics in control. And it's constantly going between the two divisions when you communicate two organs. So this picture is showing us the different divisions of the autonomic nervous system, including up top the somatic. So some things you want to take note are what are the targets that are being communicated to by each division. For somatic, you can see the target's going to be skeletal muscle, and vice versa. The autonomic, you start thinking like autopilot. You don't have conscious control over these targets. So the targets are going to be cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. That would include glands that make hormones or glands that make a product being excreted out through a duct. So one is targets of each division. Another thing you can compare contrast between the divisions are how many pathways leaving the spinal cord when you go out to communicate to the target. So let's just try to imagine, let's say what I'm highlighting here is the spinal cord. How many pathways are there leaving, going out toward the target? For somatic, it's just one pathway going to the spinal cord, going from the spinal cord, I'm sorry, out to skeletal muscle. And then for the autonomic, you look at both the sympathetic as well as the parasympathetic. You can have up to two pathways before you go out and communicate to the target by releasing neurotransmitters. So another thing you can compare are the amount of neurons leaving the spinal cord going out to the target. For somatic, it's always one. For the autonomic, you can have up to two, and that includes both divisions of the autonomic, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Okay, another thing we could compare is, do these pathways that leave the spinal cord have myelin? Remember, myelin is a lipid substance that helps to communicate targets faster should the target be very far away. Well, for somatic, which I'm highlighting here, it just makes sense since there's only one neuron going out toward the target, that this axon is going to have the most myelin so that it can communicate to the target faster. Then if you look at the autonomic, both the first pathways have some myelin, not as much as the somatic, yet there is some myelin there to communicate to its target. And then look at the second pathways. For second pathways, both for the sympathetic as well as the parasympathetic, there's no myelin here on these second pathways that go out to communicate to the targets. So another thing we compare is the amount of myelin, if you have any, on the axons going out toward the targets. For somatic, definitely has the most myelin. For the autonomic, only the first pathways, they are somewhat myelinated. And the second pathways here for the autonomic, there is no myelin. Okay, the other thing you can compare here is what neurotransmitters are being released from these neurons. The neurons, if there's more than one leaving the spinal cord, the first one is always referred to as pre. Pre means first. And then the second one being communicated to is the post. And notice in the name of this neuron, the first pathway, they have ganglion. Ganglions referring to cell bodies outside the brain or spinal cord. So the ganglion is actually the second pathways here. So the first neuron is right in front of it. So therefore, it's properly named preganglionic neuron. And then the second pathway being communicated to is referred to as postganglionic neuron. Okay, so going back to what neurotransmitters are being released here, the way I tend to do this is that every pathway, both the first pathway and the second pathways for all divisions, with an exception of one, is releasing acetylcholine. Notice I'm circling here acetylcholine. And that's the easiest way, at least for me to do this, is that every pathway, both the first and second, are releasing acetylcholine, except for the sympathetic. You'll notice the second pathway of acetylcholine is releasing a neurotransmitter here called norepinephrine. So all neurotransmitters are being released with the exception of the second pathway of sympathetic, right? They release acetylcholine. On the second pathway of the sympathetic, the neurotransmitter being released is norepinephrine. Now, remember, neurotransmitters are chemicals released by neurons, nerve cells. That's what I have circled here are neurotransmitters. However, let's erase all this. You'll notice that the sympathetic division is communicating to the adrenal gland, which sits on top of your kidneys, and causes the adrenal gland in times of fight or flight response to release hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Hey, wait a minute. Was it norepinephrine up here, a neurotransmitter? Yes, it was. So then why is it over here a hormone? Well, it depends what is making the chemical and how it's being released. Okay. So the neurotransmitter is releasing norepinephrine, then it's considered, well, I should say a neuron's releasing norepinephrine, it's considered a neurotransmitter. However, if a gland secretes a chemical and it's traveling in your bloodstream to a target involved in homeostasis, then it's considered a hormone. So same chemical, it's just that one's being released as a neurotransmitter, which is the one up top here. The other one's being released as a hormone traveling in your bloodstream. They basically have the same effect. Norepinephrine, regardless, will cause like blood vessels to constrict, which would increase blood pressure. That's one thing. Another hormone released by this adrenal gland is called epinephrine. So these two hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine, you commonly know as adrenaline, that you release in times where you're being physically active or there's some sort of threatening situation that will increase your heart rate. So that way you can send blood faster to your skeletal muscles, either to fight, which is to confront the situation, or flight, run away. So again, going back to what neurotransmitters are being used, pretty much every pathway, both for somatic and autonomic, both the first and second pathways, with the exception of the sympathetic, are releasing acetylcholine. The second pathway for the sympathetic, the neurotransmitter being released, is called norepinephrine. All right. Another thing you can compare and contrast here is for the autonomic, which division, sympathetic or parasympathetic, has the longer preganglionic neuron? Which one has the longer first pathway? Well, this one, if I can just physically see in the drawing, looks like the parasympathetic has the longer preganglionic neuron versus the sympathetic. And then the second pathway for the parasympathetic, it's actually going to be shorter. So for parasympathetic, to help me remember, I say it has a long preganglionic neuron and a short post-ganglionic neuron. And then I just remember it's the exact opposite for the sympathetic. For sympathetic, it has in the first pathway a short preganglionic neuron and a longer postganglionic neuron. Oops. I was going to start spelling postganglionic. Okay. So those are things you can compare between the divisions or targets, myelin or no myelin on the pathways, what neurotransmitters are being released, which one has longer shorter post ganglionic pathway. And anyway, I think we covered the majority here from this picture. Let me erase all this and go on to the next picture. Okay. Okay, in this drawing, let me get the marker out. You could see that the parasympathetic, just to kind of reiterate what we said before, has a longer preganglionic neuron and a very short postganglionic neuron. Versus the sympathetic, it's the exact opposite. It has a short preganglionic neuron and a longer postganglionic neuron. So going back to the picture for parasympathetic, has a longer first pathway and a shorter second. And it's just the exact opposite for sympathetic. The other thing you want to take note is the location of the cell bodies, the ganglion of the second pathways. Remember, ganglion means a cluster of nerve cell bodies outside the brain or spinal cord. So where are they located here? So let me erase this here. Okay. All right, so for parasympathetic, the postganglionic neurons or the cell bodies, the second pathway known as postganglionic neurons, are located right near the target or on the target. Oftentimes, they'll refer to it as terminal ganglion, meaning it's right on the target, right near it. The ganglion, however, for sympathetic, it's alongside the spinal cord, outside the vertebrae. So that's another thing you can compare is where the cell bodies of these second pathways located for both of these divisions. For parasympathetic, it's right near the target. And for sympathetic, it's alongside the spinal cord. All right. The other thing you can compare is where are these coming off the spinal cord? Before you go out to the target, where do these pathways originate? So for sympathetic, it's going to originate from T1, thoracic region, T1, all the way to the lumbar region, L2. I know it looks like L1, but it goes to L2. So a common other name for sympathetic, it's often referred to as thoracolumbar division because it originates off the spinal cord from T1 to L2. For parasympathetic, it originates up high in the cranium, which is like the head, but in this case, the cranium contains like the brain and your brainstem, and down low in your sacral region. So a common name for parasympathetic or an alternate name is cranial sacral division. Okay. So which cranial nerves are involved in the parasympathetic? Looks to be involved in cranial nerves 3, which is referred to as oculomotor, cranial nerve 7, which is named facial, cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal, and cranial nerve 10, the one that communicates to targets not just in the head region, but further away, vagus, and then down below from sacral regions S2 to S4. Okay, so we're looking for some type of autonomic activity through these neurons when they communicate to the targets that are going to be involved in doing parasympathetic activity, which is times to do like in digestion relaxation time. So just to give you an example, let's just take cranial nerve 3, called oculomotor. Yes, it's involved in moving the eye, which is a somatic function when you communicate to skeletal muscles. But here we're focusing on things that you cannot voluntarily control, like glands. So cranial nerve 3 does communicate to your eye, and it looks like here it's going to be involved in constricting the pupil so that you can focus on objects near during rest. Okay, we'll see that later in some other slide. Cranial nerve 7 is facial. Yes, it's involved in communicating to muscles of the face for facial expression. But again, that's a somatic function. Here we're focusing on an autonomic function. So if you look here, you'll communicate to glands like here called the lacrimal gland that produces tears, and also glands in the nasal region to produce mucus. Cranial nerve 7 also branches and communicates to some salivary glands to produce saliva. When you produce saliva is in times where you're needing to do digestion. Cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal, its autonomic function here, it communicates to another salivary gland that's going to add contributions in making saliva. And then cranial nerve 10, vagus, think of vagabond, it wanders, communicates to targets further away from the head. And cranial nerve 10 controls over 90% of parasympathetic activity. So at the heart, it's going to lower your heart rate and the amount of beats per minute. In the lungs, during rest, you don't need as much oxygen during physical activity. So branches in the lungs where gas exchange occur, they won't dilate as much. Okay, let me clear the drawing so we can look over here. And look at cranial nerve 10. Let me go back to the highlighting. Communicates to other organs further away from the head. Here, it's going to prompt production of bile that's going to be involved in digestion. It's going to prompt contractions of smooth muscle found within organs involved in doing digestion. And down here, now's the time to relieve yourself of any liquid waste through the urinary system, or also any solid waste, right, through the anal canal. And when you send blood to your genitals during arousal, that is in control of during parasympathetic activity. Okay, and those areas are controlled here from down below S2, sacral region, down to sacral region 4. And the numbers are referring to the areas here of the sacrum. All right, let me erase this. So that is, again, this is the parasympathetic, an alternate name for parasympathetic because where it originates is cranial sacral division. Why? Because it originates from cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, 10, and sacral down below from S2 to S4. Okay, this is just an alternate picture, a little bit larger, what we already looked at. Okay, now let's look at the thoracolumbar division. And thoracolumbar division is just an alternate name for sympathetic. Oh, I forgot to mention as well, going back to the parasympathetic, that just take note that you have a longer first pathway for parasympathetic, so it has a longer preganglionic neuron, and then the short post, the ganglion of these cell bodies are right on the target for parasympathetic. For sympathetic, also known as thoracolumbar division, it originates off the spinal cord from T1 to L2. Let me see if we get a larger picture here. And you're going to notice that the cell bodies of the second pathways called ganglion are not near the target like parasympathetic. They're actually alongside the spinal cord outside your vertebrae. So anytime you see the ganglion like this, they often refer to it as chain ganglion, referring to it looks like a chain. So this is called sympathetic chain ganglion, or you could say trunk ganglion, because it's alongside of the trunk area of the body. So the first pathways, they're going to leave, right? Have the ventral root, and then it's going to go into a gray ramus communicans. Why is it gray? Gray indicates that there's no myelin on the first pathways. That's why it's referred to as gray rami or ramus for singular communicans. Then it communicates to the second pathway, which is located along the chain ganglion. And then the second pathways will exit going out toward their targets through what's called a white. I should say the first pathway is white, sorry, and the second pathway is gray. Let me erase all this, okay. So the first pathway, I should have said is myelinated. So it's going to go through a white rami communicans because myelin gives the appearance of white. And then it communicates to the second pathway that goes out through what's called the gray ramus communicans. Before it goes to the target. Okay, let me make sure on that. Let me erase this real quick. Let's see, where's the eraser? All right, and just to double check, if you're ever in doubt, just go back to the drawing. Which pathways of the autonomic have myelin? Well, the first pathways, right? And then the second pathways, they don't have any myelin. So when we were looking at the sympathetic, the first pathways have myelin. They'd be going through what's called the white rami communicans. Then the second pathways are going out through what's called gray rami communicans because they don't have any myelin. Then they go out and communicate to their targets. And again, the ganglion, which are cell bodies for the sympathetic, are located outside the vertebrae alongside the spinal cord. And if that's the case, it's often referred to, as we mentioned, as sympathetic chain ganglion or sympathetic trunk ganglion. You can also have ganglion for sympathetic in front of the spinal cord. So here's an area where it's in front, and they refer to that as collateral ganglion. Just give me 1 minute. Got to find the eraser again before I can even go to the next slide. Okay. So ganglion of the sympathetic alongside the spinal cord is referred to as sympathetic chain ganglion, or you could refer to it as trunk ganglion. If the ganglion's in front of the spinal cord, they refer to it often as collateral ganglion. Okay. Oh, there's a better picture here. So let's trace the first pathway. So the first pathway for sympathetic is myelinated, right? Well, it's going to exit the ventral root because motor axons and exit through the ventral root, and it's myelinated. So next it's going to go through what's called a white rami communicans right here. Notice it says white, indicating that this axon has myelin. And then it's going to communicate to the second pathway, and the ganglion here is alongside the spinal cord. And there's no myelin on the second pathway, so it's going to exit through what's called the gray ramus communican. Gray indicating there's no myelin on this second pathway, and then it goes out and communicate to the target. So you'll notice that both the first and the second pathway, before you go out to the target, are pretty much like on the same level. There's other scenarios there where the first pathway can go up to communicate to ganglion further above or below. So here instead of the same level, you're going to see it where it's going to go up a chain. So here's the first pathway, right? And it's myelinated, exits the ventral root, and it goes through the white rami communicans. But instead of the same level, it goes up a level to communicate to ganglion above. And then the second pathway goes through a gray rami communicans and then out to the target. So that's just another alternate route that some of these pathways can do before they go to their target. And the third scenario, let's have a look here. So here again, you got the first pathway, it exits the ventral root, goes through what's called the white rami communicans, but instead of going up or down or in the same level of the ganglion, it goes to the ganglion in front of the spinal cord and then out to the target. And the ganglion in front of the spinal cord is referred to as collateral ganglion. Some other thing I want to bring to your attention is typically the effects of sympathetic are longer lasting than parasympathetic. When you're in fight or flight mode, you'll communicate to your adrenal gland and it's going to release hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. So these hormones are going to like increase your heart rate so that way you can send blood faster to skeletal muscle to do physical activity. Your breathing rate will go up and attempt to get more oxygen. Your pupils of the eye will dilate so you can be aware of your surroundings. But anyway, going back to what I'm trying to refer here is during sympathetic activity, the effects are longer lasting. It takes a while, let's say after a threat or being physically active to calm down. Why? Because of hormones. Hormones travel throughout the body in your bloodstream, and it takes a while for organs like your liver to break down the hormones. So therefore, your sympathetic has a longer lasting effect versus parasympathetic. Okay, so again, I gotta erase everything before we can move forward. And let's just pick up where we left off. All right, so we're looking here, and what you want to take note of or to realize here is that for sympathetic, it originates off the spinal cord region from T1 to L2. So an alternate name for sympathetic is thoracolumbar division. It does have a shorter first pathway and a longer second pathway. It's just the exact opposite of the parasympathetic. Also, the ganglion, the cell bodies for the second pathway, are not near the target like parasympathetic. They're actually alongside the spinal cord or in front of the spinal cord. And again, if it's alongside the spinal cord, I like to refer to it as sympathetic chain ganglion, even though you may also refer to it as trunk ganglion. So again, from T1, it comes off the spinal cord, the sympathetic, and down from L2 to go out to targets. So we're going to do some type of physical activity. We're in fight or flight mode. So now's not the time to produce tears. You would shut off production of the lacrimal gland here. Now's not the time to do secretions of saliva for digestion. Shut that off. You may see activation of your erector pili muscles, right? In an attempt to, often organisms, it's a defense mechanisms to make them look larger. You'll see the hair follicles go up, okay? Sweat glands, now's the time to produce sweat because when you're physically active, you're starting to overheat. You'll want to cool down. The heart rate's going to go up and increase to send more blood faster to skeletal muscles. The lungs, the passageways would open up and attempt to get more oxygen. The pupil, which allows light in the eye, will open up more so you can be aware of your surroundings during fight or flight. And down below, for sympathetic, again, most of this is controlled through cranial nerve 10, vagus. You want to take note, now's not the time to do digestion, so smooth muscles and digestive organs would be inhibited. You'll release hormones from the adrenal gland epinephrine, norepinephrine to increase your heart rate and blood pressure, prepare you for physical activity. Now's not the time to defecate or urinate, so you'll postpone those. The other thing I want to mention is that we mentioned during parasympathetic, you send blood to your genitals for arousal. Well, during sympathetic, will cause contractions of glands for orgasm. So you need to take note that parasympathetic and sympathetic are always going between each other when they communicate to an organ. When one's on, the other's off. Okay. Now we're looking at a reflex. And recall last time we talked about reflexes. These are responses of your nervous system that wasn't determined up behind the cortex of the brain. Reflexes that you're born with are located in your spinal cord. Now, you may have conditioned reflexes where you practice or learn something so that you don't have to think so much. You just react, kind of like playing in sports where you practice riding a bicycle. You're used to it. You don't think about it so much when you learned a conditioned reflex. And that's stored in an area of the brain called the premotor cortex. But anyway, we're looking at a autonomic reflex, not somatic. Autonomic means you're going to communicate to a target you don't have conscious control over. Example, like a gland. So step one, yes, you sense something, a stimulus, and the stimulus is going to go through a sensory neuron. Sensory, recollect, is going to go and enter the spinal cord through the dorsal root. Now, you do send information to the brain that you did sense something, but the response bypasses the upper part of the brain and it goes through the spinal cord out to the target. So step one, yes, something you sensed occur, a stimulus, activates a receptor, and the information is carried along the receptors, which is a sensory neuron. Step two goes immediately to a motor neuron and exits the ventral root to communicate to the target. So something different here that we are not seeing that we saw in a somatic reflex is there is no interneuron here between the sensory and motor. Interneuron means in between. So for a autonomic reflex, there is no interneuron. The other thing here, I recognize this as a sympathetic reflex. How do I know it's sympathetic? Well, because look at the ganglion. It's alongside the spinal cord. The ganglion for parasympathetic is near the target. So I know this is a sympathetic reflex if the ganglion is alongside the spinal cord. So just to give you an example of well, in this case, it's a sympathetic reflex, right? So let's just say in times of fight or flight, you're not doing digestion, right? You would shut off like producing tears, producing saliva. Okay. So this were like, say, a salivary gland. Now it's not the time to produce saliva. You would communicate to stop production of saliva. That would be sympathetic activity. You also have parasympathetic reflexes as well. Okay, let's clear this out. Now, the thing I looked at this and I want to bring to your attention, no matter what controls homeostasis overall is the area of the brain known as your hypothalamus. Hypo means below what? Below the thalamus up here. So the hypothalamus basically controls homeostasis. And like a king, it gives orders to other parts of the brain to carry out its functions. So here may give orders to cell bodies in the brainstem called the reticular formation to regulate the pupil size so that it can open, dilate, in other words, or constrict in times of fight or flight or rest. It can regulate communication to the heart by communicating to cell bodies in the medulla to increase your heart rate. or through cranial nerve 10 to lower your heart rate. But anyway, the key thing here is what controls homeostasis is the hypothalamus. Over here, your limbic system, if you recollect, the job of your limbic system are different areas of the brain to form an emotion and related to a memory. So you may remember like some memories may make you scared, sad, happy. Why do we have emotions associated to memories is to keep you alive. So think of predator. You had a memory where you saw a predator, you're scared, you'll stay away for survival. So your limbic system also plays a role in feeding input to your hypothalamus so that it can control homeostasis appropriately. Okay. So if I recollect a memory, let's say I remember a predator, your hypothalamus communicates to like targets in the eye to open the pupil up so that you're in a fight or flight mode. You want to see everything around you. Okay. Vice versa, if there's no threat, your limbic system, lowers your response rate, you're relaxed, you're calm, you recollect a happy memory or whatnot where you were calm, well, then your pupil, instead of dilating, would constrict. And conscious awareness of oneself, right? Not autonomic. This is all autonomic, but conscious awareness of oneself, solving problems. That's all cell bodies in the frontal lobe. All right. So the key thing I wanted to bring out here, or what you should focus on, what basically controls homeostasis and the autonomic divisions is the hypothalamus. I learned it when I was a student as the 4 Fs. What do you need? You need for survival food. If you get scared by a predator, fear, or you fight, confront. So what's that? 3. You also need water, right? And then your libido. Okay. Figure that out as far as the 4 Fs. Look it up. Okay, now let me go into the next slide. So here, just to kind of reiterate the divisions of the nervous system, central nervous system, abbreviated CNS, includes the brain and your spinal cord. Anything that comes off the brain or spinal cord, which are nerves, the 12 pericranial nerves and 31 paraspinal nerves, go under what's known as your peripheral nervous system. Okay. All right, so let's kind of just do a quick synopsis review and then we're pretty much done. Is for parasympathetic and sympathetic, they both fall under what's called the autonomic nervous division. Auto means what I learned as a student, think of autopilot. You don't have conscious awareness of controlling these targets when you communicate to them. So that means the targets will be cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. First, where do each originate off the spinal cord? Well, we already mentioned that an alternate name for parasympathetic is called craniosacral division. So it's going to originate off the brainstem from cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, 10, and down in the sacral regions from S2 to S4. For sympathetic, we mentioned that an alternate name, because of where it originates, would be the thoracic lumbar division. So it originates from thoracic region T1 down to the lumbar division L2. Location of the ganglia, okay? Where are the cell bodies of the second pathways located? For parasympathetic, recollect, we mentioned they're located right near or on the target. So oftentimes if they're right near the target, those cell bodies are referred to as terminal ganglia. For sympathetic, the cell bodies of the second pathway, which is ganglion, are located alongside the spinal cord, known as sympathetic, and I'd like to say chain ganglion, but you can also refer to it as trunk ganglion. Or if it's in front of the spinal cord, you refer to it as collateral ganglion here, or as well, an alternate name for collateral is prevertebral. But the key thing is the ganglia is alongside the spinal cord, not near the target, as in parasympathetic. All right, which one has the longer first pathway and second pathway is shorter. Okay. For the first pathway that's longer belongs to the parasympathetic. Has a very long first pathway, which is called preganglionic neuron, and has a very short second pathway called postganglionic neuron. So I like to always say for parasympathetic, it has a long pre and a short post. For sympathetic, I just know it's the opposite. Okay. I memorize one and then it's the opposite for the other. For the sympathetic, it has a shorter first pathway and a longer second pathway. Which one tends to branch out further to target spreading out more? Actually, the sympathetic, which also plays a role in having a longer lasting effect because you're releasing hormones. Remember that you release hormones in your bloodstream. It takes a while for organs like your liver to break those hormones down. What's the function of each pathway? Well, for parasympathetic, it's in times to conserve energy if you have extra, also time of rest and repair. So we often refer to parasympathetic as digestion and relaxation time. For sympathetic, prepares your body for physical activity. Either we confront, which means fight, confront the situation, or run away, flight. So oftentimes sympathetic, that's how it's referred to as fight or flight time. What neurotransmitters are being used for each pathway? For each pathway, you are releasing everywhere acetylcholine except the second pathway for the sympathetic, where you're going to be releasing norepinephrine. As well, you'll be releasing hormones, norepinephrine and epinephrine for the sympathetic pathways. Okay, I think I paused it and I'm back. So we left off here for sympathetic. The neurotransmitters being used for both divisions, both parasympathetic, sympathetic. Basically, it's all acetylcholine except for the second pathway of sympathetic. It would be norepinephrine. And then for the hormones, you do release hormones from the adrenal gland for sympathetic. The hormones being released are norepinephrine and epinephrine. Okay, we're not going to focus so much on this, but yes, look, I have to bring it to your attention since it's here. Typically, it's not the chemical that determines what happens at the target, whether it can excite or inhibit the target. What really determines what happens at the target is the receptor that the chemical is binding to. So if you look at the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, it can bind to different receptors. And the two types of receptors that bind acetylcholine, one's called nicotinic, the other one is called muscarinic. And when acetylcholine binds the nicotinic, typically will cause excitation at the target. Example, skeletal muscle. Releasing acetylcholine on the skeletal muscles where you have nicotinic receptors cause the muscle to contract. But there's also a different type of receptor called muscarinic. It can also cause excitation in most cases, but look at the cardiac muscle. Acetylcholine doesn't excite cardiac muscle, it actually inhibits it. So the type of receptors on the cardiac muscle are not nicotinic, but are called muscarinic. So again, bringing to your attention, it's not the chemical / neurotransmitter that determines what happens at the target. What determines what happens at the target is the type of receptor on the target. Okay, so let's look at nicotinic receptors. Where do we find nicotinic receptors? Okay, let me highlight here. On the second pathways for both divisions for the autonomic, and the second pathways were called postganglionic neurons. So on the second pathways of the autonomic, you're going to find nicotinic receptors. And so let me just jump real quick to the picture here. So these are the second pathways here. These are called postganglionic neurons for both divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. So you have nicotinic receptors that will bind to acetylcholine. And you probably notice nicotinic, make sure I'm spelling it. It reminds you of nicotine. So the receptor is named after the chemical that can mimic it. Nicotine does bind to these receptors, so they're called nicotinic receptors. So nicotinic receptors are on the second pathways for both divisions, parasympathetic and sympathetic, and also on skeletal muscles, you'll have nicotinic receptors where they can bind acetylcholine. All right. The other type of receptors that can bind acetylcholine are called muscarinic. Where do we find muscarinic receptors? You find them like on cardiac muscle and targets you cannot voluntarily control, like glands. Okay, let me erase this, close this out, and let's jump back to our graph that we were looking at. So again, nicotinic receptors is one type of receptor that binds to acetylcholine. And we should go one more. And we find nicotinic receptors on the second pathways of both autonomic divisions and also on the somatic division where you have skeletal muscle, you'll find nicotinic receptors. Muscarinic receptors, where do we find them? You find them on parasympathetic target organs, which would include what? Glands, cardiac muscle, and even here it says glands like your sweat glands. Sometimes it can cause excitations, but in most cases, when you bind to a muscarinic receptor, sometimes will cause it to inhibit. All right, so receptors that bind to acetylcholine, right? There are two types, nicotinic and muscarinic, but overall, they go under a major category called cholinergic receptors. So the two types of cholinergic receptors are nicotinic and muscarinic. And again, cholinergic receptors, what neurotransmitter they bind? They bind to acetylcholine. All right, now receptors that bind to epinephrine and norepinephrine, in general, they're called adrenergic receptors. The different types of adrenergic receptors are alpha and beta. It's not too hard here. All you need to know is that anytime you bind norepinephrine, epinephrine, you're going to be doing some type of sympathetic activity. Okay. So for beta 1, you find them on the heart. Well, if this is sympathetic activity, it's going to cause the heart rate to go up and the strength of the contraction of the heart to be higher. Beta 2 receptors you find in the lungs. So we're in fight or flight. You want passageways where you're going to do gas exchange to open up more. So these passageways called bronchioles, the smooth muscle relaxes, causing them to open up more so you can get more oxygen. Beta 3 receptors you find on adipose tissue. Now's the time where you bind to this receptor. You want to release adipose to use to make ATP. Okay. Alpha 1, you find them on blood vessels. Okay. So that means when norepinephrine binds to these, causes the vessel to constrict. And when you squeeze a vessel, in other words, constrict, that squeezes blood faster through the vessel, also causes blood pressure to go up. Alpha 1 receptors you also find in the pupil of the eye. So during fight or flight, you want the pupil to open up so you can see everything around you. So it dilates, which means open up. All right, some alpha 2 receptors it says inhibits insulin secretion by the pancreas, promotes blood clotting. Okay. But anyway, what you want to get out of this mainly is the receptor types that bind to epinephrine, norepinephrine. In general, they're called adrenergic, and then the subtypes could be beta or alpha. Okay, drugs. How can drugs work? We're not going to focus so much on how drugs work, but just to give you an idea, some drugs can do the exact same thing as a neurotransmitter. They can do the same effect by binding to the receptor. Remember the nicotinic receptors? They bind nicotine. So yes, acetylcholine binds to nicotinic receptors, but so does nicotine. So some drugs do the exact same thing. Think of having a key to a lock. If you have a copy, it does the same thing to the lock, which may be to open it. So for nicotinic or nicotine agents, they mimic the acetylcholine. So you may find some nicotinic agents in helping you to stop smoking, right? You're still getting the effects of the nicotine without actually smoking. All right, what do we have here? Yes, this is the same thing, mimics the effect of the neurotransmitters. Um, some drugs can cause the neurotransmitter to last longer. How can you help the neurotransmitter effect last longer is by inhibiting the enzymes that will break down the neurotransmitter. So typically, like acetylcholine is broken down by enzymes, right? Now, typically, if you didn't have the enzyme around, that means the neurotransmitter effect will last longer. So some drugs, they inhibit the enzyme that would normally break down the neurotransmitter. So if you don't have the enzyme around, that means the effects of acetylcholine can last longer. Okay, so some of these drugs, neostigmine, it's given to increase availability of acetylcholine for people that have this disease, myasthenia gravis. Can also be used for like chemical warfare where you overly stimulate a target by inhibiting the enzyme that will break down the neurotransmitter. Anyway, you can look at this at your own leisure. I'm not going to test on that or focus so much on it. Let's move on. Now, I do want to bring to your attention is that most organs, most of them, are being communicated by both parasympathetic and sympathetic. Only few exceptions will you see where a target's being communicated by sympathetic only. Okay. So let me erase that real quick. So let's just look at the iris of the eye. The iris is the colored portion of the eye. It is smooth muscle and it controls the opening of the eye called the pupil. So during fight or flight, which is sympathetic, you want to be aware of your surroundings when there's like some type of threat or when you're physically active. So during sympathetic, you would cause the pupil to dilate, telling the iris to open up the pupil. However, during parasympathetic, there's no threat, you're not physically active, then parasympathetic would constrict the pupil, causing it to close more since there's no threat. Now let's have a look. Glands. Your lacrimal gland makes tears, your gastric glands or gastric juice in the stomach. This is oftentimes doing digestion. So when are these glands going to be activated? Well, when's the time to do digestion relaxation? That would be parasympathetic. So parasympathetic communicates to these glands to do their job, which is going to be involved in digestion and relaxation. So it stimulates the glands. But during fight or flight, now is not the time to do digestion or tear up. So sympathetic communicates to the glands and doesn't promote them, but inhibits them. That includes, well, let me erase this. Salivary glands, when you make saliva during parasympathetic activity. So it's activated then. When is it inhibited? During sympathetic. Now, here's a target only being communicated by sympathetic. This is an exception where you don't have both divisions, parasympathetic as well as sympathetic, communicating to this target. Only sympathetic communicates to the sweat gland. And you just got to think, when do you make sweat? Usually when you're hot, right? And when are you hot? Most often when you're what? Physically active during fight or flight. So during physical activity or threat, your sympathetic will communicate to sweat glands to produce sweat. During rest, there's no overheating. Well, you don't communicate to the sweat glands, so they don't produce sweat. But the key thing in here is to take note that there is no communication to sweat glands via parasympathetic, only sympathetic. Another target only being communicated by sympathetic is your adrenal medulla gland. The medulla is referring to the middle part of the gland. So during times of fight or flight, you'll communicate to the middle of the gland and to release hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine, that will prepare your body for physical activity. An example, increase your heart rate to send blood faster to skeletal muscle. For parasympathetic, there is no communication to the adrenal medulla in parasympathetic. The smooth muscle in your skin that raises your hair follicles, remember the erector pili muscle? There is no communication by parasympathetic to this smooth muscle. You only communicate to the smooth muscle by sympathetic activity, which will cause your hair follicles to go up. Okay, so when you communicate to this erector pili muscle, the hair goes up in times of fight or flight. Why? Well, one is it's like a defense mechanism in times where you're threatened. You'll see certain organisms that look larger as the hair follicles go up and attempt to look larger. Okay. For us, you can also activate that smooth muscle in times where you're cold. So that way it's another level before heat will leave the body. But the key thing here is your erector pili muscle is another example where it's only being communicated by sympathetic. Your heart muscle is communicated by both divisions. So if the heart rate goes up, that would be sympathetic in control. When it's gone down in the amount of beats or the strength, then parasympathetic's in control. Coronary vessels, okay. These are the blood vessels that provide oxygen, nutrients to the heart muscle. You'll notice this is another target only being communicated by sympathetic. Sometimes the physical activity, you need more blood, oxygen to be delivered to the heart muscle. Those blood vessels will open up more. Your bladder, where you store liquid waste, well, when's the time to relieve yourself would be during parasympathetic activity. So you communicate to smooth muscles in the bladder to go ahead and do contractions, push the liquid waste out. That is parasympathetic. In times where you're in fight or flight, sympathetic will communicate to a portion, how can I say it? It's skeletal muscle to postpone urinating or defecating. So you can postpone urinating or defecation for a period of time. So during fight or flight, you want to postpone that. Okay. So you don't necessarily defecate or urinate during fight or flight. Now you may ask yourself why some organisms where they get threatened or scared defecate or urinate on themselves. Well, when you're getting over bombarded with so much information in a life-threatening scenario, you may lose conscious control of this sphincter, which is skeletal muscle, therefore urinating or defecating on yourself. But most often during fight or flight, you postpone that, okay? And then the lungs, well, when do I need more oxygen? Well, during fight or flight. So during sympathetic, you'll communicate to smooth muscles there, somewhat to, I'm going to say, relax so that the passageways called bronchioles will dilate more, therefore an attempt to get more oxygen. So here, sympathetic causes bronchioles to dilate. Bronchioles are passageways leading to where gas exchange occurs in the lungs. And during parasympathetic, you don't need as much oxygen when you're at rest, so parasympathetic would constrict bronchioles. So for most organs, again, both divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic, do communicate to organs. It's just that when one's on, the other is off. There are exceptions where only sympathetic communicates to a target. Examples would be your sweat glands, your adrenal medulla, erector pili muscle. All right, some other targets, what's going on during parasympathetic and sympathetic. All right, let's have a look. Your digestion, your smooth muscle and digestive organs, when would they contract to do digestion? Well, they're going to be activated during parasympathetic when it's time to do digestion. And during times of fight or flight, well, sympathetic's going to shut it off. The liver, okay, so during parasympathetic, Now's the time to do digestion, absorb nutrients. So you're going to increase sugar uptake after a meal. Vice versa, during fight or flight, you want to release any stored sugar so that your cells can make ATP. Your gallbladder is involved in digestion, so it's only going to be excited during parasympathetic versus sympathetic, which shut off the gallbladder secreting its contents called bile. The kidney, well, this is a target only being communicated by sympathetic, and it makes a hormone called renin, which helps promote your blood pressure to go up and causing vessels to constrict. The genitals, both for males and females, when you send blood to the genitals during arousal, that's parasympathetic activity. And during contractions of glands during orgasm, that would be sympathetic activity. Blood vessels. Okay, blood vessels most often are being communicated only by sympathetic. Not always, but most often. And typically what sympathetic does, it'll release neurotransmitters causing the vessel to constrict so that you can send blood faster to areas that where it's needed the most, like skeletal muscle. But if you're already at the target and you need more oxygen, more delivery of blood to the tissue, then the vessel there will dilate. And again, it's not the neurotransmitter that tells me what happens at the target, it's the receptor that binds to the neurotransmitter. So some receptors on blood vessels will cause the vessel to constrict, others, they'll have a different receptor and may cause it to dilate. But again, most blood vessels being communicated only by sympathetic. Forming blood clots, well, most often that's sympathetic activity would help to increase forming a blood clot. You can think of during fight or flight, you may cause bleeding, so you want to form a blood clot. Your metabolism is going to be increased during sympathetic activity. Metabolism means every reaction that occurs in the body. Adipose tissue, basically when you release lipids is during, says here, sympathetic activity. And one last thing, that a picture, which is not that picture, okay? Someone surfing is pictured in the textbook. But anyway, here you're looking at areas that's named referred pain. Sometimes you may feel pain superficially, but actually it's occurring deep in the body within an organ. So to give you an example, like let's say you're having a heart attack, you may feel pain superficially on the left side of the chest and down the left side of the arm. So times where you feel pain superficial, even though something's occurring deep in the body, it's called referred pain. And why is it that you feel pain superficially? Is that the sensory going up to the brain, sometimes sensory from different areas are traveling together to the brain within tracts. And the brain may misinterpret one sensory location for another. So here, these different color outlines are indicating where if you feel pain superficially, it may be occurring somewhere deep within the organ or deep in the body. And again, that's called referred pain. And other than that, that's pretty much chapter 14 wrapped up. And I'll talk to you again when we start chapter 15.